Hello, and welcome back to the Handel Improvisation project. Just before I get started, I just want to say that if you haven't already seen the first few videos of this series explaining what this is about, you might just want to go and click back through the playlist linked below before watching this video, especially if you're just a beginner and you're not sure what chords and things like that are about. The basic idea is that we're using the opening chord progression from Ombra mai fu, which is an aria from an opera by George Friedrich Handel, to improvise in different styles. We're only using the opening 15 bars of the piece for our improvisation, but there's a lovely recording of the whole piece in Bill's intro video to this series, so if you haven't yet heard that, you might want to pause this video and quickly go back and check it out so that you have a bit of a frame of reference for what we're going to be talking about in this video. So today we're going to be thinking about improvising in the style of Chopin, who is a famous Romantic composer from Poland. Chopin primarily wrote music for the piano since he was an extremely competent pianist and improviser, but he did also write music for other instruments as well. One of the most famous types of piece that he wrote for the piano was called a nocturne, which is the style of piece that we're going to be imitating today with our own improvisations. The name can roughly be translated as of the night or nocturnal, so a nocturne is meant to evoke images of nighttime, and that's just something to bear in mind when you're trying to improvise your own piece in this style. You might also be interested to know that Chopin actually owes a pretty big debt of gratitude to the Irish composer John Field, who originally invented the nocturne form. And he'd actually written several of them while Chopin was just still a little kid. So yeah, sorry, just as an Irish person myself, I just had to give that little plug for John Field there. You should go and check out his nocturnes at some point if you have a chance, since they're also really, really beautiful. Anyway, as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about improvising in the style of a Chopin nocturne. Now, this can seem like a really daunting task at first, since you can think, well, it was a lot easier copying Bach or Mozart since their music is technically easier than Chopin, who uses a lot more notes. But the truth is that if you play around with a few basic ideas and patterns, you can actually get a pretty convincing nocturne sounding piece. After all, that is kind of what improvisation is all about at the end of the day. Coming up with patterns that sound good, but that aren't necessarily as thought out or as structured as a written composition. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of how we actually go about improvising Chopin like this, let's just listen to an example improvisation I did on the chord progression from the opening section of Ombra mai fu in the style of Chopin. So what you just heard there was an improvisation I did on the opening chord progression from Ombra mai fu. You'll notice that just as in my previous videos of this series, most, if not all, of the improvisation was happening in my left hand. And that's just to keep things a bit more simple for now, since if you try changing things up in the right hand, it can get really confusing, especially if you're just starting out. So we're just going to stick to playing around with the chords in the left hand for now. Another thing you'll notice about the left hand is that I was, for the most part, playing a bass note followed by two chords as a pattern throughout the improvisation. So something like this. If you refer to the booklet linked underneath this video, you'll find that the bass chord pattern I was using actually rhythmically corresponds to the downbeat of each bar in the score. So in other words, the whole bass chord pattern repeats every bar, with the exception of a few places where I put in an extra bass note here and there. Now, this is a very Chopin-esque pattern that's used in many of his nocturnes. Actually, let me just play you something really quick so you can hear an example of a piece where this pattern is used. This is the opening section of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. You might actually know it since it's pretty famous. Let's just have a listen here. So now that we've got a starting point for our Chopin improvisation, that is focusing on the left hand that typically goes bass, chord, chord, let's try to think about some things we might be able to add to that to make it sound a bit more Chopin-esque with the melody on top, as opposed to just playing the plain chords with the bass chord chord pattern. Well, to do this, there are a few things we can try to incorporate in the left hand that I included in my improvisation at the start, and they are the following. And just to say, don't worry if you don't understand these terms, I'm going to explain them in a minute. So the first one is using a pedal note, okay? So pedal note. That was a pedal note in the bass there. Then there's using diminished chords. So this is a diminished chord. Another one is creating brief counter melodies within the left-hand chords. And then the final one that we're going to talk about today is reharmonization, which is kind of similar to using the diminished chords, but I'm just going to leave it in its own category for now. Now, don't worry if that sounds like an overload of information to you. Just try to follow along now as I briefly explain what each of these things mean. So the first thing that I mentioned was a pedal note, okay? And that just refers to an unchanging note that is held underneath a series of different chords, okay? So if you have a chord in the right hand, let's just take a C triad, and a bass note of C in the left hand. And if you move up through different triads in the right hand, while playing the same note in the left hand, then you're using what's called a pedal note in the bass, like this. The pedal note is staying constant there underneath all of that, okay? The second term, diminished chord, which is something that you probably might have heard of before, is just a type of chord that's entirely made up of intervals of minor thirds, okay? Now, don't worry if you don't know what an interval is either. I will have a link to one of Bill's videos in the description that explains what they are. For now, just know that a minor third interval is the distance from C to E flat. Okay, so to find that, you can just count up 4 notes from the starting note. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's your interval of a minor third. And yeah, I mean, if I were to continue, I can find more of these. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's more minor thirds. In order to find the diminished chord now, all you do is you start on the note and find the series of minor thirds like I just did, and you'll have your diminished chord, okay? So we'll start on C one more time and just explain that. 1, 2, 3, 4, there's your first interval. 1, 2, 3, 4, there's your second one. 1, 2, 3, 4, there's your third one. 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's a full diminished chord. And you can find that by starting on any note, really, okay? Now, the third term, countermelody, is pretty self-explanatory. It just refers to a melody that counters the main melody in a piece. Or, in other words, a second melody that complements the original melody. So, for example, if I were to play a C major scale in the right hand, and I played the same thing going the opposite way in the left hand, I would be creating a counter melody to my C scale in the right hand if I were to play them at the same time, like this. Now, there are a million ways you could create counter melody. That's not the only way. You could go or do something a lot more interesting. You know, you can do basically anything to create a counter melody. But they're just a few examples of what a counter melody is. Okay. The last term, reharmonization, also pretty much means what it sounds like. So it means taking a melody that's normally harmonized one way with certain chords, and then putting alternative chords underneath it to make it sound different. In other words, reharmonizing it. So let me just see if I can give you an example here. Let's do the opening of Happy Birthday, okay? So the opening of Happy Birthday goes like this. Okay, so now let me try to reharmonize that a bit, okay? I'm just gonna come up with some chords in the left hand that make it sound different. Okay, so that sounds completely different now because I've changed the chords in the left hand. So these are the 4 basic ideas that we're going to be playing around with today in our Chopin improvisation. Just to go over them one more time, We're going to be using pedal notes. We're going to be using diminished chords, countermelodies, and reharmonization. Okay. Now you can switch these up and use them in whatever way you like when you improvise by yourself. But let me now just go through and explain what I was doing in the improvisation you heard at the start and why I may have used some of these patterns in certain places. I just want to mention at this point, though, that if you don't know the chord progression of ombra mai fu, you're going to find this pretty confusing. So my advice would be to either download the booklet linked underneath this video, which has a chord chart of the complete progression, or you can go back and have a look at my video on improvising in the style of Mozart that I made earlier in this series, which explains the progression in a bit more detail. So now I'm just going to go through and play the progression here once to get it in our ears. And then after that, I'm going to go through my original improvisation and talk about some of the things that I did. Okay, so here's the original progression from start to finish. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So that was a complete opening chord progression from ombra mai fu. Now, don't pay attention to the arrangement of notes that I was using when I just played the chord progression there. They're just the basic chords, and I was just playing them in whatever position I felt like. When you're playing around with the chords, you can use obviously whatever arrangement you feel like, and you should try and play around with it a few times so that you're a lot more comfortable with the chords, and try them in different arrangements. Moving on now, let's now talk about how I use the techniques I mentioned earlier in the video in my original improvisation. So in the first 3 bars, I decided to use a pedal note of F in the bass. So remember, the pedal note is where you have one note in the bass, but your chords change above. So I decided to keep the pedal note of F in the bass, okay? So since the chord progression goes from F to C7 and back to F again, it just made sense for me to keep that bass note of F while playing the C7 chord in bar 2, which gives it a really nice, rich sound because you end up with this interesting chord on the downbeat of bar 2. Okay? And using a pedal note like this is pretty common in romantic texture that lots of composers used to use to get a richer sound while still moving through a chord progression. And you can use this in pretty much any place. I mean, another example would be you could actually do the same thing in bars 4 through 6 of ombra mai fu if you wanted. So something like this. So I just kept the B flat there in the bass while changing through the regular chords, okay? Now, you might notice that in bar 4 of my original improvisation, I changed the harmony, just like I did actually just there as well, from a B flat chord in the left hand to a G minor chord, because normally the chord progression goes F, C7, F, and then B flat, right? But I changed it to a G minor chord. Now, the only reason I did this was because I thought it would sound nice. I mean, you don't have to do it. The choice is up to you when you improvise. This is just an example of one of the things that I did. So this would be called reharmonization, since I'm changing the chord underneath the melody to sound different. Now, it's not a big change since the difference between B flat and G minor is only one note, but it still makes an audible difference. You might think to yourself, well, why the heck did you do that? What's the point in changing something so small and so trivial? And the answer is pretty simple. I mean, it's just basically because I wanted to, okay? I mean, the whole thing with improvisation is to let your ear guide you into trying different things. So the reason that I pick one chord over the other on any given day is pretty simple. It's just because I felt like doing it and it sounded good to me. Moving on to bar 5 of my improvisation, I played an example of what you would consider a brief countermelody to the actual melody, okay? So in bar 5, I did this. Well, I'll just go from bar 4 really quickly. So you can hear there, that's the counter melody that I'm talking about, moving from C to C sharp. Okay. So what I did there in bar 5 was just play the bass note on the downbeat of the bar, and then play the chord on the second beat, and that's in line and pretty standard part of our bass chord pattern that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. But what I did differently on the third beat of the bar is that instead of playing another chord, I turned the bottom note of the chord into an active voice, and I moved it from C to C sharp, like that, okay? And one reason that I did that was to add in some chromatic movement, okay, into the piece, meaning movement going up or down by single notes on the piano, or what you would call half steps in America, or semitones in the UK, okay? So just moving up each note on the piano. That's called chromatic movement. Chromaticism like this is a very important part of Romantic music, especially when used in a harmonic sense, which is what it's being used for here. And what I mean by that is that harmonic chromaticism is movement between chords based around a chromatic bass line. So a line that goes up like this. And so how it's a chromatic harmony here is that in bar 5 we start on a chord of C, and then we sharpen the C to a C sharp, implying an A7, and then you could theoretically go up to a D chord. So if I do just watch the bass here in my left hand, so C to C sharp, D, and then you could go to a D, B7 chord, and then an E chord, right? So you can hear the bass is going up by semitones there, but the chords on top are changing with it, right? So that's harmonic chromaticism. Anyway, don't worry if you don't understand all this. That's kind of just a bit of a tangent there, and it's confusing and not really important. So I'm just saying here that this type of chromatic movement is idiomatic of Romantic music. So it's good to try and put in chromatic lines or harmonies wherever you can. Including in Chopin, okay? That's actually another reason why the diminished chord is so useful, but we'll get to that in a minute. So just to continue my train of thought here about moving from C to C sharp here in bar 5, one other reason that I might do that is because of voice leading, okay? Now, if you don't understand what voice leading is, you might want to go back and look at my previous video in this series about improvising in the style of Bach, where I explain the concept in a bit more detail. But basically, since we're thinking about the C, the bottom note of the left-hand chord, as a counter melody, we have to think about where it's going, or more importantly, where it sounds like it's going as a voice, right? So if you listen to the resulting harmony of moving the voice in this way, you'll actually hear what I mean. So let's just listen here. So you can hear that da da dum in the left hand, right? So that's the voice leading there in play, okay? And this is good voice leading, since the voice sounds like it's naturally wanting to move up there by itself. It would sound completely different, and it would just be completely bad voice leading if it were skipping all over the place. Like, voices don't do that, right? So that's why that would be bad voice leading. So just to quickly recap the first 5 bars of my original improvisation here, I used a pedal note in bar 2, okay? So I kept that bass there of F, right, throughout. I also used a G minor chord instead of a B flat chord in bar 4. So I changed it from that to this, okay? And then I also added in a chromatic counter melody in bar 5, even though it was very, very brief. I did this. So I'm changing the C to a C sharp there, right? And it sounds like it wants to resolve to here. Altogether, if I just play it in the left hand by itself, it sounds like this. And if I add in the melody, it sounds like this. So let's move on now to bar 6, where we would normally have this C9 chord, okay? And you can call it whatever you want. You can call it a G minor 6 or whatever. It doesn't really matter. There's a million different names for that chord. In my original improvisation, I actually did two things here. So firstly, I reharmonized the melody, changing the chord in the left hand from C7 to G minor over B flat, okay? And again, I just did this because I wanted to, no other particular reason. And then the second thing that I also did was I added in a counter melody in the left hand, okay? So I did this. So you can hear that there, that's the counter melody, okay? And so that's kind of similar to what I did in the previous bar where I did this, but this time I'm actually starting with the D, so the middle note of the chord, okay? And all I did was I moved it up by step within the F major scale to an F. So I started on D, moved up to E, and then F, okay? And the reason that I did that was because in the F major scale, D, E, and F are all natural. So I was just inclined to keep them natural here as well, since it would most likely sound okay. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do I know which notes to play as a counter melody? This all sounds really complicated. This is all going way over my head. And, I don't know anything about counter melodies and things like that. It's really confusing. And in some ways you're right, in some ways you're not. It's all about practice is the truth. So the more that you try and do these things, the better you're going to get at it. So even if you're really, really slow at making counter melodies at first and you have to really think them out and it's really confusing and a slow process, make sure you still give it a go and practice it so that you can train your musical ear. One thing to remember here is that these counter melodies don't have to be really complicated, okay? You can keep them really short, just brief interjections that add to the original melody. Mine, for instance, were only 1 or 2 notes long or 3 notes, so just make sure to keep them simple and manageable. Bear in mind also that this sort of practice, and this is just useful in general to say with these types of videos, like, when improvising in the style of Chopin or Mozart or Bach, that all of this sort of practice is useful for all aspects of musicianship, okay? That's a really important point. Improvising in the style of Chopin helps you to better improvise in the style of Bach, but it also helps you to improvise better in the style of Elton John or Adele, or whatever it is else that you want to do. I mean, it even helps you sing because it trains your ear. So this is not some sort of niche practice that we're doing here that doesn't apply to any normal musicians. So don't think of it like that. We're just training our musicianship here. So a good example of a succinct counter melody that I was just talking about is what I did in bar 8 in my improvisation, where instead of using a C7 chord, I turned it into a diminished chord, right? And then I moved the inner voice back to turn it into a C7 chord. So here I really did a few things all at once again. I reharmonized the melody, changing it to a diminished chord, but I also created a counter melody moving the D flat down to a C. So it sounded like this. Okay. Again, try not to think of this as overly complicated, some sort of mumbo jumbo that's really hard to understand. Just use your ear to guide the decisions that you make, okay? So if you do some of the things that I suggest, like the diminished chords or reharmonization, that's great. But if not, make up something else that sounds good to you, okay? Anyway, for the rest of the improvisation, I did pretty much the same sorts of things that I've just been talking about. So I put in another counter melody in bar 11, and I added in another diminished chord in bar 12. Let me just see if I can replicate what I did here. Okay, so that's what I did there. You can hear the diminished chord and the counter melody there. And you'll notice that I use just the same counter melody that I used in the previous time. So bar 6, I used the same counter melody. Right? So it just goes to show you don't really have to be very inventive with these things. So I just want to briefly address what I did at the end of all of this, though, at the end of the progression, since that might be a bit more confusing. Really, it all just boils down to more reharmonization of the last 3 bars, okay? So instead of playing the original progression, which goes C, C7, F, B flat, C sus4, C, and then F, I actually played this. And that's actually fewer chord changes than in the original. And all I did there to come up with that was to think at the downbeat of bar 13, well, I'm on a chord of C, which is the dominant, so I just need to stay here to get back to F by the downbeat of bar 15, okay? Now, I could have done something simple like just moving up to the D in the bass and then back down to C and resolving to F in the final bar, which would have sounded something like this. But I wanted something that was a bit more stylistic and idiomatic, so I introduced this interesting harmony here at the end, okay? Right, that's a really cool, crunchy, very Chopin-y sound there. Unfortunately, it would take a really, really long time to explain exactly why this particular harmony works here. But just remember that knowing these types of chords that are idiomatic is like learning licks on the guitar, okay? So after you look through scores for a while, and after you've played enough Chopin, these things become more of a second nature to you, okay? It's all just down to how much of the music you want to explore for yourself and which bits and pieces you take from it, okay? Again, just use your ears and you'll be fine. On a similar note, for the very last bit of the improvisation, I did a basic reharmonization of the final note, which is F, to end on a B flat chord, okay, a chord 4, instead of the chord 1, which eventually resolves back to the final tonic chord F, okay? And this is another romantic idiom, your prolonging of the cadence here, and the cadence is the part of the music where it's like drawing to a close, okay? And you can do this a million different ways, but this is just one way that I thought would sound nice. So why don't you go and try and play it some different ways for yourself, prolonging the cadence in other interesting ways, and just see what you can come up with, okay? So that's the full improvisation that I did at the beginning of this video explained. Okay, that took a long time to explain, but hopefully I'm making some sense with all the things that I've just said. Now, remember what I just said is pretty advanced, okay? So, you know, even a lot of accomplished musicians would find this quite difficult. So please don't be hard on yourself if you find it really difficult. If that's the case, my advice, as usual, would be to simplify it until it becomes manageable for you, okay? Start with just the basic chords in the left hand with the melody. Just go... do something like that, okay? You just got the chords in the left hand, doesn't matter which arrangement, and then you've got the melody in the right hand, okay? Then you can move on to trying the bass chord pattern, okay? This way, the whole progression would start to sound like this, giving you a basic skeleton to play around with. So finally, once you have this pretty well in rhythm, this bass chord pattern, You can then move on to adding in diminished chords and small countermelodies and all of the other things that I mentioned in this video, okay? Like I've said in other times, this whole process should be fun, so don't get down on yourself if you find it difficult or if you have to simplify things. Keep practicing, use your metronome, keep listening, which is the most important part, and you will definitely get better slowly but surely, okay? Now, eventually, you might want to take it to an even more difficult level. I'm not going to go into detail as to what you can do here to make it really, really complex, but basically what you want to do to keep developing is to be really inquisitive and try to find out patterns for yourself, okay? Listen to a lot of Chopin, play more pieces by Chopin, and then take these patterns that you notice and see if you can apply them to your own improvisations. You might hear another left-hand accompanimental pattern that he uses a lot, for example, you know, so like... So that's just the opening 3 bars using a different accompanimental pattern that I just came up with there. But you also, you know, you can hear things in the right hand, like sometimes he uses broken sixths. Okay, something like that. Or there's, you know, things like chromatic thirds. So just see if you can take some things. I mean, they don't have to be hard, like technically difficult. So the thirds might be a bit difficult. Even the sixths are quite hard. But see if you can take some of these things and add them into your own playing, okay? I'll talk about more of this sort of stuff in a later video, but for now, just let's just have a listen to another improvisation I did on the same piece in the style of Chopin, a bit more advanced, and just take note of some of the more advanced changes that I make, okay? So that's it for another really, really long video. I hope you enjoyed it and you found it useful. Please make sure to give it a thumbs up if you got something from it. And don't forget to subscribe to both Bill's channel and my channel for more videos like this. Make sure to also leave any comments or questions you have for either of us down in the comments section beneath this video. And let us know what you make of the series as a whole. We'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Anyway, that's it for me for today. Stay tuned for more videos in the near future, and I'll see you again soon.